la invasión y bloqueo de Cuba, por la intervención en Santo Domingo y por mantener bases en Guantánamo, en Panamá.
The Cuban Revolution was an armed uprising in Cuba that overthrew the government of Fulgencio Batista, a Cuban military officer and politician who forced his way into power and then paved the way for an era of government corruption. Fulgencio Batista ruled Cuba with U.S. backing. Wealth thrived in Havana's nightclubs and casinos, whilst rural areas suffered extreme poverty and inequality. He was El Hombre, the man, and for 3 decades he was one of Cuba's most controversial leaders. It would take Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution to unseat him. During these times, opposition grew. Students, workers, and activists sought change, which clashed with Batista's brutal police force. Among them was Fidel Castro, a young lawyer who condemned Batista's corruption and was running for office member of the Cuban People's Party prior to Batista's seizure of power. Born August 13, 1926 near Piran, Cuba, and died November 25, 2016, he transformed his country into the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere and became a symbol of communist revolution in Latin America. Some people admired Castro because he provided free education and healthcare, reduced inequality, and promoted Cuban independence. He became a global symbol of resistance to the U.S. influence and supported humanitarian efforts abroad. However, others disliked Castro for his authoritarian rule, suppression of freedoms, and human rights abuses. His policies caused economic hardship, food shortages, and led many Cubans to flee the country, as elections were not democratic.
Now, we will be moving on to the timeline. It began with the assault on the Moncada Barracks military barracks in Santiago de Cuba on the 26th of July 1953, led by Fidel Castro. It ended on January 1st, 1959, when revolutionaries led by Che Guevara and Fidel Castro's replacements, Raúl Castro and Huber Matos, each took control of the city Santa Clara in Santiago de Cuba and forced Batista to flee out of the country. Despite his temporary imprisonment afterwards, he continued to lead further attacks and campaigns and guerrilla warfare in 1957 and 1958, where Castro's troops attacked Batista. In 1955, after receiving political liberty, Castro moved to Mexico and joined Che Guevara and his other revolutionaries, where they established the 26th of July movement. Moving on, in November of 1956, the Granma expedition took place, where Castro and his 82 rebels set sail from Mexico to Cuba on the ship Granma. When they arrived, most of them were killed, but some of the survivors managed to flee to the Sierra Maestra highlands. Additionally, on New Year's Day of 1959, Batista announced his resignation and flees the country to the Dominican Republic under the protection of Rafael Trujillo. He later on moved to Spain, where he spent the rest of his life. After Batista's resignation, Castro's forces arrived to the capital, later taking the role of prime minister. And in April of 1961, around 1,500 anti-Fidel Castro Cuban exiles launched the unsuccessful Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. This invasion was planned and funded by the United States government. Furthermore, the Cold War's most direct and dangerous confrontation between the US and the USSR was the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. This brought the two superpowers to the brink of a nuclear war, and it started when the USSR began sending ballistic medium and intermediate range missiles to Cuba, which meant that most of the eastern part of the United States could have been reached by these weapons. Lastly, after 1962, Castro establishes a one-party communist government in Cuba, the first in the Western Hemisphere. This aligned closely with the USSR, which included Marxist-Leninist rules such as state control of the economy, education, and media. The new Cuban government encouraged land and redistribution and industry, nationalization, while banning private business ownership.
Now, let's get to the impacts of the Cuban Revolution. Nationally, the revolution drastically transformed Cuba's political and economical systems. Fidel Castro's socialist state implemented reforms such as the agrarian reform laws of 1959 and 1963, redistributing land to the poor and nationalizing industries. A key achievement was the 1961 literacy campaign. where young brigadistas taught rural farmers, captured in iconic photographs of students writing for the first time. Healthcare and education became universally accessible, boosting literacy to 96%. However, testimonies from political dissidents, like those archived by the Cuban Heritage Collection, reveal the darker side of repression and mass exile. The Cuban diaspora profoundly shaped countries like the US, particularly Miami. Regionally, the revolution inspired leftist movements across Latin America. Che Guevara's diary documents the spread of revolutionary ideals to nations like Bolivia, while CIA declassified files on the Bay of Pigs invasion highlight the US determination to stop the spread of communism. Events like the Cuban Missile Crisis, immortalized in photos of Soviet missiles in Cuba, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Globally, Cuba's alignment with the Soviet Union turned it into a Cold War flashpoint. The 1960 trade agreement with the USSR symbolized this partnership, and Cuba's medical diplomacy, such as doctors sent to Angola, became a hallmark of its revolutionary ideals. Castro's 1966 Tricontinental Conference speech positioned Cuba as a leader in anti-colonial struggles, captured in archival footage. However, the US embargo, documented in State Department files, isolated Cuba economically and exacerbated its struggles. Today, the revolution's legacy remains contested. While its achievements in education and healthcare endure, economic challenges persist. Interviews from the past reflect a divided populace, pride in the revolution's ideals, but frustrations with the stagnation. In summary, the Cuban Revolution profoundly impacted Cuba, the region, and the world. Its legacy endures, embodying both the promises and challenges of revolutionary change.
Today, Cuba is still a communist country. The government controls things like school, healthcare, and the news. Some people think this is good because education and healthcare are free for everyone. However, others feel it isn't fair because they can't vote for their leaders or speak freely about their opinions. There are also big problems such as food shortages, low salaries, and not enough supplies for everyone. Cuba has struggled for many years. The United States still doesn't trade with them, and after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost a lot of its money and support. On top of that, the COVID-19 pandemic has made things even harder. Tourists who helped bring in money to Cuba stopped visiting for a long time. This made it difficult for the country to get enough money for food, medicine, and other important things. Even with these problems, Cuba is proud of its healthcare and education. Doctors from Cuba are known all around the world for helping in other countries during emergencies, like when COVID-19 occurred. Almost everyone in Cuba can read and write, and people live long, healthy lives compared to other countries. Recently, more people in Cuba have been asking for change. Many young people are used to the internet and can share ideas there, even though the government tries to control what they can do online. People are protesting for more freedom and better living conditions. The government is trying to keep the old system, but it's becoming harder as more people demand a better future.
In summary, the Cuban Revolution reshaped Cuba and global politics, leaving a legacy of both progress and controversy. Thank you everyone for watching.